I never thought I'd be telling this story, but here I am. My name is Evelyn, and this is how my life fell apart and how I put it back together. It all started on what seemed like just another Tuesday morning in San Francisco. The fog was rolling in from the bay, blanketing the city in its usual gray embrace. I remember thinking it was fitting, given the state of my marriage. Ko and I had been together for over a decade. We'd built our tech startup from scratch, working side by side, dreaming of changing the world. In the early days, we were unstoppable. Late nights coding, pitching to investors, celebrating small victories with cheap takeout, those were the times I missed the most. But somewhere along the way, things changed. Success came, and with it, a distance I couldn't seem to bridge. That morning, as we got ready for work, I tried to ignore the tension that had become our constant companion. Ko was unusually chatty, cracking jokes about our upcoming presentation to the board. I found myself smiling, caught off guard by his sudden lightness. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe things were finally turning around. We took our usual shortcut to the office, a winding road that hugged the cliffs overlooking the Pacific. It was a breathtaking drive, one that usually helped clear my head before diving into the day's challenges. But today, something felt off. I noticed Ko's knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his jaw clenched despite his earlier jovial mood. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. He glanced at me, a strange look in his eyes. "Yeah, just thinking about the presentation. Hey, mind if we pull over for a sec? I want to show you something." Before I could respond, he was already steering the car to a small turnout overlooking the ocean. The view was stunning, the vast expanse of water stretching out to the horizon, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my stomach. Ko got out of the car, and I followed, wrapping my arms around myself against the chilly sea breeze. He walked to the edge of the cliff, hands in his pockets, staring out at the water. I stood a few feet behind him, waiting. "Remember when we used to come up here to brainstorm?" he asked, not turning around. "Back when we were just starting out?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "Yeah, I do. We'd sit on the hood of that old Beta car and dream about making it big." He chuckled, but it sounded hollow. "We did make it big, didn't we? Bigger than we ever imagined." I took a step closer, trying to read his body language. "Ko, what's going on? We're going to be late for the meeting if we don't get going." That's when he turned to face me, and I saw it, a look in his eyes I'd never seen before. Cold. Calculating. It sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the wind. "There is no meeting, Evelyn," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I cancelled it this morning." Confusion washed over me. "What? Why would you do that without telling me?" He took a step toward me, and instinctively, I took one back. Because I needed to take care of something first. Something that's been holding me back for far too long. In that moment, I knew. All the little doubts, the unexplained phone calls, the late nights at the office, they all came crashing down on me at once. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ko's face twisted into a cruel smile. "You know, I really did love you once. But you've become a liability. The board, the investors, they all see me as the face of the company now. You're just in the way." I found my voice then, anger rising to meet my fear. "Is that what this is about? Power? Money? Ko, we built this company together. Everything we have, we earned as a team." He laughed, a sound that sent ice through my veins. "Oh, Evelyn. Always so naive. There's no we in business. Only winners and losers. And I've decided, I'm going to be the winner." I saw his intention a split second before he moved. I turned to run, but the loose gravel at the edge of the cliff betrayed me. I felt his hands on my back, a hard shove, and then, nothing but air. The fall seemed to last forever. Images flashed before my eyes, our first date, our wedding day, the night we landed our first big contract. All of it, a lie. The wind rushed past my ears, drowning out my own screams. I braced for impact, certain these were my last moments. But fate, it seems, had other plans. My descent was broken by a series of jagged outcroppings and dense bushes. Each impact sent waves of pain through my body, but it slowed my fall. When I finally came to a stop at the bottom of the cliff, I was battered, bleeding, and in agony, but alive. For a long moment, I just lay there, the taste of blood in my mouth, struggling to breathe. The world spun around me, and I fought to stay conscious. Slowly, painfully, I took stock of my injuries. My leg was definitely broken, my right arm felt like it was on fire, and I could feel blood trickling down my face from a gash on my forehead. But none of that mattered. Because through the haze of pain and shock, one thought burned brighter than all the rest: he tried to kill me. The man I loved, the man I trusted with everything, he had just tried to end my life. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness. The sun moved across the sky, shadows shifting as the day wore on. I knew I needed to move, to get help, but every attempt to sit up sent fresh waves of agony through my body. As the light began to fade, a new fear gripped me. Night was coming, and with it, the cold. If I didn't find a way out of here soon, exposure would finish what Ko had started. That thought, the idea of him winning, of getting away with this, gave me the push I needed. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I forced myself to sit up. The world tilted dangerously, and I had to close my eyes for a moment to keep from passing out. When I opened them again, I saw my phone lying a few feet away, having fallen from my pocket during the fall. Hope surged through me, only to be dashed when I saw the cracked screen. Still, I dragged myself over to it, every inch an exercise in endurance. The phone powered on, but as I feared, there was no signal. Of course not. We were in a dead zone. That's why Ko had chosen this spot. He'd planned every detail. Anger rose in me then, hot and fierce. It burned away some of the fog in my mind, sharpened my focus. I looked up at the cliff face looming above me. It was steep, treacherous, but not impossible. And right now, it was my only way out. I knew it was insane. In my condition, I should stay put and hope for rescue. But something told me that if I didn't save myself, no one would. Ko would make sure of that. So, with a determination I didn't know I possessed, I began to climb. Every movement was agony. My broken leg dragged uselessly behind me, my injured arm screamed in protest as I used it to pull myself up. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. As I climbed, my mind raced. How long had Ko been planning this? Were there signs I'd missed? I thought back to all the late-night strategy sessions, the times I'd caught him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Had it all been leading to this moment? The sun was setting by the time I neared the top of the cliff. My entire body was shaking with exhaustion and pain, but I was almost there. Just a few more feet. And then, as I reached for the next handhold, my fingers slipped. For one heart-stopping moment, I felt myself falling backwards. Everything we'd built, everything I'd survived for, it was all about to end. But somehow, miraculously, I managed to catch myself. Hanging there, one-handed, my feet scrabbling for purchase, I made a promise to myself. I would survive this. I would climb out of this hell. And when I did, Ko would learn what it truly meant to lose everything. With one final, excruciating effort, I hauled myself over the edge of the cliff. I lay there on solid ground, gasping for air, my whole body screaming in protest. But I was alive. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above me, I knew this was just the beginning. Ko thought he'd written the end of my story. But he was wrong. This wasn't the end. It was just the start of a whole new chapter. I don't know how long I lay there at the top of the cliff, my body a map of pain and exhaustion. The stars above me blurred and shifted, and for a moment, I wondered if this was what dying felt like. But then a cool breeze swept over me, carrying with it the salt tang of the ocean, and I knew I was still very much alive. And if I was alive, I had to keep moving. Slowly, agonizingly, I pushed myself up to a sitting position. Every movement sent shockwaves of pain through my body, but I gritted my teeth and forced myself to focus. I needed to assess my situation, to figure out my next move. My leg was definitely broken. I could see the unnatural angle it was bent at, even in the dim starlight. My right arm was swollen and throbbing, probably fractured. The gash on my forehead had stopped bleeding, but it had left a trail of dried blood down my face. I was a mess, but I was breathing. And right now, that was enough. I looked around, trying to get my bearings. The road where Ko had parked our car was nowhere in sight. I must have climbed up a different part of the cliff face. In the distance, I could see the twinkling lights of San Francisco, a cruel reminder of how close yet far away help was. My first instinct was to try my phone again, but I knew it was useless. Even if by some miracle it had survived the fall and the climb, there was no signal out here. No, I was on my own. I closed my eyes, trying to think. What would Ko's next move be? He'd assume I was dead, of course. He'd probably head back to the office, start laying the groundwork for his story. Poor Evelyn, so distraught over the pressures of running a successful company, she'd driven off alone and, what? Crashed. Jumped. I could almost hear his fake sobs, see the crocodile tears he'd shed for the police, the board, our friends. The thought made me sick, but it also lit a fire in me. He thought he'd won, thought he'd gotten away with it. But he'd made one crucial mistake, he'd underestimated me. And I was going to make damn sure he regretted that. With renewed determination, I started to drag myself towards the road. It was slow going, each movement a lesson in pain management. But I kept at it, inch by excruciating inch. I focused on the little things, the feel of the grass under my hands, the distant sound of waves crashing against the cliffs, the cool night air on my skin. Anything to keep my mind off the pain and the enormity of what lay ahead. As I moved, I started to plan. I couldn't go home. That would be the first place Ko would look if he suspected I was alive. The hospital was out too. He'd be monitoring admissions, waiting to finish the job if necessary. No, I needed to disappear, to buy myself some time to think and to heal. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the road. It was deserted at this time of night, which was both a blessing and a curse. No one to see me in this state, but also no one to help. I managed to pull myself up to a seated position at the side of the road, my back against a large rock. Now all I could do was wait and hope that someone would drive by. As I sat there, I found my thoughts drifting back to the early days of our relationship. Ko and I had met at a startup weekend in Silicon Valley. We were both young, ambitious, full of ideas about how technology could change the world. I remember being drawn to his energy, his passion. We stayed up all night, coding and brainstorming, and by the end of the weekend, we had the beginnings of a business plan and the start of something I thought was special. Those first few years were a whirlwind. We poured everything we had into our company: time, money, sweat, tears. There were moments of doubt, of course. Times when we thought about giving up, going back to our safe, steady jobs. But we pushed through, believing in each other and in our vision. And then, finally, we got our big break. A major tech company wanted to integrate our software into their platform. Suddenly, we were the talk of the valley. Investors were lining up, eager to get a piece of the next big thing. We moved into a shiny new office in San Francisco, hired a team, started living the life we'd always dreamed of. Looking back now, I wonder if that was the beginning of the end. Success changed Ko in ways I didn't recognize at first. He became more aggressive in meetings, more willing to cut corners. I told myself it was just the pressure of running a growing company, that he'd settle back into his old self once things calmed down. But things never calmed down. The company kept growing, and Ko kept changing. He started excluding me from important decisions, scheduling meetings when he knew I couldn't attend. At first, I confronted him about it, but he always had an excuse. I was overreacting, he'd say. I needed to trust him to do what was best for the company. And like a fool, I did trust him. Even as I felt him slipping away, even as I saw the company we'd built together becoming something I barely recognized, I trusted him. Because he was my husband, my partner, the person I'd chosen to build a life with. God, I'd been so blind. A pair of headlights in the distance snapped me out of my memories. I straightened up as much as I could, waving my good arm frantically. Please, I thought, please stop. To my immense relief, the car slowed and pulled over. An older man got out, his face a mask of concern as he took in my battered appearance. "Good Lord, miss. What happened to you?" he asked, already reaching for his phone. I opened my mouth to explain, but found I didn't know what to say. The truth was too bizarre, too horrifying. And a part of me, the part that had spent years protecting KO and our company's image, balked at the idea of telling a stranger. I fell, I managed to croak out. Hiking. Lost my footing. The man looked skeptical, understandably so, given my business attire and obvious lack of hiking gear. But to his credit, he didn't push. "We need to get you to a hospital," he said, already moving to help me up. "No," I said, more forcefully than I intended. The man stepped back, startled. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "I mean, no hospitals. Please. I need to get to a hotel. Somewhere quiet, out of the way. Can you help me?" He hesitated, clearly torn between wanting to help and knowing that the right thing to do was to get me medical attention. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't insist. Finally, he nodded. "All right," he said, though he didn't sound happy about it. "I know a place. Small motel, down the coast a ways. Very discreet. Will that work?" I nearly cried with relief. "Yes, that's perfect. Thank you." With his help, I managed to get into his car. As we drove, I caught sight of myself in the side mirror and winced. I was barely recognizable, my face a mess of cuts and bruises, my hair matted with blood and dirt. I looked like I'd been through hell, which, I supposed, I had. The man, Bob, he'd introduced himself as, kept glancing at me worriedly. I could tell he had 1,000 questions, but thankfully, he kept them to himself. Instead, he filled the silence with quiet chatter about the weather, the latest sports scores, anything to keep my mind off whatever had happened to me. As we drove further down the coast, away from the bright lights of San Francisco, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Fear, certainly, I was injured, alone, with no real plan. But also a growing sense of determination. KO had tried to kill me, had betrayed everything we'd built together. But he'd failed. I was still here, still fighting. And I was going to make sure he paid for what he'd done. We pulled up to a small, nondescript motel about an hour down the coast. Bob helped me out of the car and to the front desk, where a sleeper-looking clerk barely glanced up from his magazine. If he thought anything was odd about my appearance, he didn't show it. "Rooms paid for the week," Bob said, pressing the key into my hand. "There's a clinic in town if you change your mind about seeing a doctor. And, well, if you need anything else, you just let me know, all right?" I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. This stranger's kindness, when my own husband had tried to kill me, was almost more than I could bear. Once in the room, I collapsed onto the bed, the events of the day finally catching up with me. But even as exhaustion pulled at me, my mind was racing. I needed a plan. I needed to heal, yes, but I also needed to figure out my next move. KO thought he'd won, thought he'd gotten rid of me for good. But he was about to learn just how wrong he was. As I drifted off to sleep, one thought crystallized in my mind: this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where I would reclaim everything that had been taken from me, and make KO rue the day he ever thought he could beat me. The game was on. And this time, I was playing to win. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the cheap motel curtains, momentarily disoriented. For a split second, I thought I was back home, that everything had been a terrible nightmare. But then I tried to move, and the pain hit me like a freight train. It hadn't been a nightmare. It was all too real. Gritting my teeth, I managed to sit up and take stock of my situation. I looked even worse in the harsh light of day, my skin a canvas of bruises in various shades of purple and blue. My leg was swollen to twice its normal size, and I knew I needed medical attention, no matter how risky it might be. I reached for the motel phone, my fingers hovering over the digits. Who could I trust? KO would have told everyone by now that I was missing, possibly dead. He'd be watching, waiting to see if I surfaced. I needed someone who wouldn't immediately alert him, someone who could help me without raising suspicion. And then it hit me. Sarah Chen, our company's legal advisor. She'd always been more my friend than KO's, and she was smart as a whip. If anyone could help me navigate this mess, it was her. With shaking fingers, I dialed her private number from memory. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I held my breath, praying she'd pick up. "Hello." Sarah's voice was cautious, professional. I swallowed hard. "Sarah. It's Evelyn. I'm alive." There was a long pause, and for a moment, I feared I'd made a terrible mistake. But then Sarah spoke, her voice low and urgent. "Evelyn? Oh my God. Where are you? Are you okay?" "Ko said you'd." I know what Ko said. I cut her off, my voice harder than I intended. "None of it's true. Sarah, I need your help. But you can't tell anyone I'm alive. Not yet. Can you do that?" Another pause, shorter this time. "Of course," she said firmly. "Tell me what you need." I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "First, I need a doctor. Someone discreet, who won't ask too many questions. And then, I need you to prepare those documents we discussed last month. It's time." I could almost hear the gears turning in Sarah's mind. Last month, in a moment of paranoia that I'd quickly dismissed, I'd asked her to draw up papers that would transfer full ownership of the company to me in the event of my death or disappearance. At the time, I'd told myself I was being silly, that I'd never need them. Now, they were my lifeline. "Consider it done," Sarah said. "I'll text you the address of a clinic I know. The doctor there owes me a favor. He'll take care of you, no questions asked. And Evelyn, be careful. He's not the man we thought he was." I laughed, a bitter sound that made my ribs ache. "Trust me, Sarah. I know exactly what kind of man Ko is now." After I hung up, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. For the first time since Ko had pushed me off that cliff, I felt a glimmer of hope. I wasn't alone in this fight. The next few days passed in a blur of pain and planning. The doctor Sarah sent me to was as good as his word, patching me up without prying into my story. My injuries were severe: a broken leg, 2 fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and more cuts and bruises than I could count, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time. As I recuperated, Sarah kept me updated on what was happening back in San Francisco. Ko had reported me missing, spinning a tale of how I'd been depressed lately, overwhelmed by the pressures of running the company. He'd shed crocodile tears in front of the board, vowing to keep the company strong in my absence. It made me sick to my stomach, but I forced myself to listen, to understand what I was up against. But Ko had made one crucial mistake. In his haste to seize control, he'd overlooked the changes I'd made to the company structure. As far as the law was concerned, I was still the sole owner of everything we'd built. And now, thanks to Sarah's quick work, all of that ownership was officially transferred to me. Ko thought he was sitting pretty, ready to take over everything we'd worked for. He had no idea that the ground was about to crumble beneath his feet. As soon as I was well enough to travel, I knew it was time to make my move. Sarah had arranged everything: a car with tinted windows, a back entrance to the office building, a conference room where the board would be waiting. They thought they were there for an emergency meeting called by Ko. They had no idea what was really coming. The night before, I stood in front of the mirror in my motel room, barely recognizing the woman staring back at me. My face was still bruised, my arm in a sling, my leg in a walking cast. But my eyes were blazing with a fire I'd never seen before. I was no longer the trusting, naive Evelyn who had climbed that cliff with her husband. I was a survivor, a fighter. And I was ready to take back what was mine. The next morning, I walked into our office building for the first time since Ko had tried to kill me. My heart was pounding, but my steps were steady. The security guard at the desk did a double take when he saw me, his eyes widening in shock. "Mrs. Montero," he stammered. Mr. Montero said. I cut him off with a sharp look. "Mr. Montero was mistaken," I said coolly. "I'm very much alive, and I'm here for the board meeting. Is everyone assembled?" Still looking shell-shocked, he nodded and waved me through. As I made my way to the conference room, I could feel the eyes of every employee on me. The office was eerily quiet, the usual buzz of activity replaced by stunned silence and whispered conversations. I paused outside the conference room door, taking a deep breath to steady myself. This was it. The moment of truth. I could hear Keo's voice through the door, smooth and confident as he addressed the board. He had no idea what was coming. With one last steadying breath, I pushed open the door. The reaction was immediate. Gasps filled the room, followed by a heavy silence. Keo, who had been mid-sentence, froze, his face draining of color as he stared at me like he'd seen a ghost. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I walked slowly to the head of the table, my eyes locked on Keo the entire time. He looked like he was about to be sick, his confident facade crumbling before my eyes. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm and clear. Good morning, everyone. I apologize for my unexpected absence. There have been some developments that I need to address. One of the board members, an older man named Frank, was the first to find his voice. Evelyn? My God, we thought. Keo told us you were dead. I finished for him, my eyes never leaving Keo's face. Yes, I'm sure that's what he told you. But as you can see, the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated. Keo seemed to snap out of his shock then, forcing a smile that looked more like a grimace. Evelyn, thank God you're alive. We've all been so worried. Where have you been? What happened to you? I could almost admire his acting skills. If I hadn't lived through his betrayal myself, I might have believed the concern in his voice. But I wasn't here to play games. What happened to me? I repeated, my voice ice cold. That's an interesting question, Keo. Why don't you tell the board what really happened? About how you drove me to that cliff. About how you pushed me over the edge, thinking the fall would kill me. About how you planned to take over the company once I was out of the picture. The room erupted into chaos. Board members were on their feet, shouting questions, demanding explanations. Keo was shaking his head frantically, trying to deny everything, but I could see the panic in his eyes. He knew he was trapped. I let the commotion continue for a moment before raising my hand for silence. Surprisingly, everyone complied. I know this is a shock, I said, my voice steady. But I have proof of everything I'm saying. And more importantly, I'm here to inform you all that regardless of Keo's actions, this company is still under my control. 100% of the shares are in my name, as they have been since last month when I made some preemptive changes to our ownership structure. I nodded to Sarah, who began distributing documents to the stunned board members. You'll find everything in order, I continued. Keo has no legal claim to this company. His attempt to remove me has failed. And now, it's time for him to face the consequences of his actions. As if on cue, 2 security guards entered the room. I hadn't told them the whole story, but they knew enough. Please escort Mr. Montero from the building, I said, my voice never wavering. His access to all company resources is revoked, effective immediately. Keo exploded then, shouting accusations, threatening lawsuits. But his words fell on deaf ears. The board members looked at him with a mixture of shock and disgust. As the guards led him away, still protesting, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. There would be police reports to file, endless questions to answer, a company to rebuild. But in that moment, watching Keo being escorted out of the building we'd built together, I knew one thing for certain: I had survived. I had won. And this was just the beginning of my comeback. The days following Keo's dramatic exit from the company were a whirlwind. I barely had time to breathe, let alone process everything that had happened. There were police statements to give, press releases to draft, and endless meetings with the board to reassure them that the company was in good hands. I threw myself into the work, partly because it needed to be done, but mostly because it kept me from dwelling on the betrayal that still felt like an open wound. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Keo's face as he pushed me off that cliff. The man I'd loved, the man I'd built a life with, had tried to kill me. How do you even begin to process something like that? But I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. The company needed me, and in a way, I needed it too. It was the one thing Keo hadn't managed to take from me, and I was determined to make it stronger than ever. The media circus was intense. News of my miraculous survival and KO's attempted murder had leaked, and suddenly we were front-page news. Reporters camped outside our office building, hoping for a glimpse of me or a quote from anyone who would talk. I kept my head down, letting our PR team handle the press. I wasn't ready to tell my story to the world. Not yet. Inside the company, things were chaotic. Employees were shell-shocked, struggling to reconcile the KO they thought they knew with the man who had tried to kill his wife and business partner. I made a point of being visible, walking the floors, talking to people. I wanted them to see that I was okay, that the company would be okay. It wasn't easy. There were whispers, sidelong glances, people falling silent when I entered a room. I couldn't blame them. If our roles were reversed, I'd probably be gossiping too. But I kept my chin up and my voice steady. I had survived worse than a few rumors. About a week after my return, I called an all-hands meeting. It was time to address the elephant in the room and chart our path forward. As I stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some new, all anxious, I felt a sudden wave of déjà vu. How many times had KO and I stood here together, announcing new products or celebrating milestones? Now it was just me, and the weight of that responsibility settled heavily on my shoulders. I took a deep breath and began to speak. I know the past few weeks have been difficult and confusing for all of us. The events surrounding my absence and return have been unprecedented, to say the least. I want to thank you all for your patience and professionalism during this challenging time. I paused, looking around the room. Some people nodded encouragingly, others looked away, uncomfortable. I pressed on. I'm not here to rehash the details of what happened. Those are a matter for the police and the courts now. What I am here to talk about is our future, the future of this company that we've all worked so hard to build. I clicked to the first slide of my presentation, showing our company logo. This company was founded on a vision of innovation, integrity, and impact. Recent events have shaken that foundation, but they haven't destroyed it. We are more than the actions of one individual. We are a team, a family, and together, we will not just survive this crisis, we will emerge stronger. As I laid out our plans for the coming months, new product launches, restructured teams, enhanced ethics training, I could feel the mood in the room shifting. The tension was still there, but there was something else too. Hope, maybe. Or determination. I ended the presentation with a slide that simply said questions. As hands shot up around the room, I braced myself. This was the part I'd been dreading. The first question came from a young developer in the back. Mrs. Montero, how can we trust that something like this won't happen again? How do we know there aren't other surprises waiting for us? It was a fair question, and one I'd anticipated. That's an excellent point, Jake. Trust is earned, and I know it will take time to rebuild that trust. That's why we're implementing new transparency measures across all levels of the company. Every major decision will now require sign-off from multiple department heads, and we're establishing an anonymous reporting system for any concerns or irregularities. We're also bringing in external auditors to review all of our financials and practices. No more surprises. The questions continued, ranging from practical concerns about ongoing projects to more personal inquiries about my well-being. I answered each one as honestly as I could, even when the answers were difficult. As the meeting wound down, I felt a subtle shift in the room. The anxiety and uncertainty that had permeated the air when we started had given way to something else, a cautious optimism, perhaps. We weren't out of the woods yet, not by a long shot. But we were moving in the right direction. After the meeting, as people filed out of the auditorium, several stopped to shake my hand or offer words of support. It was a small gesture, but it meant more to me than I could express. For the first time since my return, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. Back in my office, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. The adrenaline that had carried me through the past week was starting to wear off, and exhaustion was setting in. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes for just a moment. A soft knock at the door startled me. It was Sarah, my savior and now acting COO. "How are you holding up?" she asked, concern evident in her voice. I managed a weak smile. "I'm still standing. That's something, right? She nodded, taking a seat across from me. The board was impressed with your presentation. They're feeling more confident about our direction. Good, I said, rubbing my temples. We need them on board for what's coming next. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. Evelyn, I know you're focused on the company right now, and that's important. But have you given any thought to what you need? I blinked, caught off guard by the question. What do you mean? I mean, she said gently, that you've been through a traumatic experience. You nearly died. Your husband tried to kill you. And instead of taking time to process that, you've thrown yourself into work. That's not sustainable. I felt a lump form in my throat. Sarah was right, of course. I'd been so focused on saving the company, on not letting KO win, that I hadn't allowed myself to really feel anything about what had happened. I don't know how to do this, Sarah, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. How do I run a company and try to heal at the same time? How do I face our employees every day knowing that they're wondering if I'm going to fall apart? Sarah reached across the desk, squeezing my hand. You don't have to do it alone. That's what I'm here for. That's what your team is here for. We can share the load while you take care of yourself. I nodded, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Thank you, I managed to say. As Sarah left my office, I turned to look out the window. The San Francisco skyline stretched out before me, the same view I'd admired countless times before. But now, everything looked different. The world had shifted on its axis, and I was still trying to find my footing. But as I watched the sun setting over the bay, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope for the future, hope for healing, hope for redemption. The curtain had risen on this new act of my life. It wasn't the story I had planned, not by a long shot. But it was my story now, and I was determined to write an ending that would make me proud. As I turned back to my desk, ready to tackle the mountain of work still ahead of me, I made a promise to myself. I would not let KO's actions define me. I would not let his betrayal break me. I would rise, stronger and wiser, and I would build something beautiful from the ashes of what he had tried to destroy. The road ahead would be long and difficult, I knew that. But for the first time since that fateful day on the cliff, I felt ready to face it. One step at a time, one day at a time, I would reclaim my life and my company. The curtain had risen. And this time, I was the one writing the script. Weeks turned into months, and slowly but surely, things at the company began to stabilize. The media frenzy died down, our stock price recovered, and we even launched a new product line that was receiving rave reviews. On the surface, it looked like we had weathered the storm. But beneath that calm exterior, I was still struggling. Nightmares plagued my sleep, vivid recreations of that moment on the cliff. Sometimes I'd wake up gasping for air, convinced I was falling. Other times, I'd dream of KO's face, twisted with that cruel smile, as he pushed me over the edge. Sarah had been right about needing help. At her insistence, I'd started seeing a therapist, Dr. Patel. Our sessions were tough, forcing me to confront emotions I'd been trying to bury under mountains of work. But they were helping. Slowly, I was learning to process what had happened, to untangle the knot of fear, anger, and betrayal that had taken root in my chest. It was during one of these sessions that Dr. Patel asked me a question that would change everything. Evelyn, she said, her voice gentle but probing, have you considered confronting KO? I stared at her, stunned. Confront him? Why would I want to do that? She leaned forward, her eyes kind. Because right now, he still has power over you. He's the boogeyman in your nightmares, the shadow lurking in the corners of your mind. Sometimes, facing our fears head-on can be the most effective way of overcoming them. I left that session with my head spinning. Confront KO? The idea terrified me. But at the same time, I couldn't deny a certain appeal. To look him in the eye, to demand answers, to show him that I had survived, that I was stronger than his attempt to destroy me. For days, I wrestled with the decision. I talked it over with Sarah, who was supportive but concerned. If you do this, she said, you need to be prepared. He's going to try to manipulate you, to twist things around. Are you ready for that? I wasn't sure, but I knew I had to try. I was tired of being afraid, tired of letting the memory of what he'd done control me. It was time to take back my power. Arranging the meeting wasn't easy. Ko was out on bail, awaiting trial. His lawyers initially refused my request, but I was persistent. Finally, they agreed to a supervised meeting at the courthouse. The day of the confrontation, I woke up feeling oddly calm. As I got dressed, choosing a crisp white blouse and my favorite power suit, I caught sight of myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same one who had trusted Ko blindly all those months ago. This woman was stronger, wiser, battle-tested. I was ready. Sarah insisted on coming with me, waiting outside the room for support. As we walked into the courthouse, she squeezed my hand. "Remember," she said, "you're in control here. If at any point you want to leave, just say the word." I nodded, grateful for her presence. Then, taking a deep breath, I walked into the room where Ko was waiting. He looked smaller somehow. The confident, charismatic man I'd married was gone, replaced by someone who seemed diminished. His designer suit hung loosely on his frame, and there were dark circles under his eyes. But when he looked up and saw me, I caught a flash of something in his eyes. Surprise? Fear? I couldn't quite tell. "Evelyn," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't think you'd come." I sat down across from him, keeping my face neutral. "I'm full of surprises, aren't I? Like surviving when you tried to kill me." He flinched at my words, looking away. "Evelyn, I don't know what to say." "I'm so don't," I cut him off sharply. "Don't you dare say you're sorry. You're only sorry you got caught." For a moment, silence hung heavy between us. Then, gathering my courage, I leaned forward. "I want to know why, Ko. Why did you do it? Was it the money? The power? Or was our entire marriage just some long con?" Ko's face twisted, a mix of emotions I couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't like that. Not at first. When we started the company, I loved you. I believed in us, in our vision. So what changed? I pressed, fighting to keep my voice steady. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache. "Success, I guess. The more we grew, the more I wanted. And you were always so idealistic, so focused on doing the right thing. I started to see you as a roadblock, holding us back from true greatness. I felt a surge of anger. A roadblock? I was your wife, your partner. We built that company together." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But somewhere along the way, I convinced myself that I deserved more. That I could do better without you holding me back. It was like a sickness, Evelyn. The more I had, the more I wanted. And you were in the way." I sat back, studying him. The man in front of me was a stranger, so far removed from the person I thought I'd married. "So you decided to kill me," I said flatly. He winced at my bluntness. Yes. God, Evelyn, I don't even know how to explain it. It was like I was outside myself, watching someone else make these terrible decisions. But it was me. I did it. I tried to kill you." Hearing him admit it, so baldly, sent a shiver down my spine. But it also felt freeing, in a way. Like lancing a festering wound, letting the poison out. "You know what the worst part is?" I said, surprised by how calm I felt. "It's not that you tried to kill me. It's that you betrayed everything we built together. Our company, our vision, our life. You threw it all away for what? Money? Power? Was it worth it, Ko?" He looked up at me then, and for the first time, I saw real remorse in his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't worth it. I lost everything that mattered. And I did it to myself." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his confession hanging between us. Then, slowly, I stood up. "I didn't come here for your apology, Ko. I came here to tell you that you failed. You tried to destroy me, but you didn't. I'm still here. I'm still standing. And our company, it's stronger than ever." I walked to the door, then turned back for one last look at the man I'd once loved. "Goodbye, Ko. I hope you find peace someday. But I won't be there to see it. As I walked out of that room, I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The nightmares might not stop overnight, the pain might not vanish completely, but I had faced my demon. I had looked Ko in the eye and shown him that I was stronger than his betrayal. Sarah was waiting for me, concern etched on her face. How did it go? She asked tentatively. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in months. It went well. I think I'm ready to move on now. As we walked out of the courthouse into the bright California sunshine, I felt a sense of possibility that I hadn't experienced since before Ko's betrayal. The road ahead was still long, still challenging, but for the first time, I felt truly ready to face it. The confrontation was over. The healing could begin. And I was ready to write the next chapter of my story, one where I wasn't defined by what had been done to me, but by what I would do next. As we drove back to the office, I found myself smiling. The future was uncertain, but it was mine. And that was enough. The months following my confrontation with Ko flew by in a whirlwind of activity. As the date of his trial approached, I found myself caught between two worlds, the bustling, forward-moving energy of our recovering company, and the slow, methodical grind of the legal system. Every day brought new challenges at work. We were in the midst of launching a groundbreaking new product, one that had been in development long before Ko's betrayal. It felt fitting, somehow, that this innovation, born from our shared vision of what technology could do, would be the thing to solidify our company's comeback. But even as I threw myself into work, I couldn't escape the looming specter of the trial. Preparations were intense. I spent hours with the prosecutors, going over my testimony, reliving that terrible day on the cliff over and over again. It was exhausting, both emotionally and physically, but I was determined to see it through. Ko needed to face the consequences of his actions. The night before the trial was set to begin, I found myself unable to sleep. I stood by the window of my apartment, looking out over the San Francisco skyline. The city lights twinkled like stars, a reminder of all the dreams and ambitions that had brought Ko and me here in the first place. How had it all gone so wrong? As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I made a promise to myself. Whatever happened in that courtroom, I wouldn't let it define me. I was more than Ko's victim, more than the woman who survived his betrayal. I was Evelyn Montero, CEO, innovator, survivor. And I was ready to face whatever came next. The courthouse was a madhouse when we arrived. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions and thrusting microphones in my face. I kept my head high, Sarah by my side, as we made our way inside. The click of cameras and the buzz of voices faded as the heavy doors closed behind us, replaced by the solemn quiet of justice in motion. The trial itself was a blur of testimonies, evidence presentations, and legal arguments. I sat through it all, my face a mask of calm even as my insides churned with a mix of emotions I couldn't quite name. When it was my turn to testify, I took a deep breath and stepped up to the witness stand. Looking out over the courtroom, I caught Ko's eye. He looked small in his ill-fitting suit, a far cry from the confident businessman I'd once known. For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity. But then I remembered the cold determination in his eyes as he pushed me off that cliff, and my resolve hardened. I told my story clearly and calmly, my voice steady even as I recounted the most harrowing details. I described the drive to the cliff, the sudden change in Ko's demeanor, the moment I realized what he was about to do. I spoke of the fall, the pain, the fear. And I talked about the aftermath, the struggle to survive, to reclaim my life and my company. As I spoke, I could feel the weight of the jury's attention. They leaned forward in their seats, their eyes never leaving my face. I saw shock, sympathy, and anger flit across their expressions. But most of all, I saw belief. They believed me. And in that moment, I knew, whatever the outcome, I had already won. The defense tried their best to discredit me, to paint Ko as a man temporarily driven to madness by stress and ambition. But their arguments felt hollow in the face of the evidence. The prosecutor had done his job well, presenting a clear and compelling case for attempted murder. As the trial neared its end, tension in the courtroom was palpable. The closing arguments were delivered with passion on both sides, but I barely heard them. My mind was already racing ahead, contemplating what came next. Win or lose, life would go on. The company needed me. I needed to be ready. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman stood, a small piece of paper clutched in his hand. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. On the charge of attempted murder, we find the defendant, Caio Monteiro, guilty. The word hung in the air for a moment before the courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity. Reporters rushed out to break the news, lawyers conferred in hushed tones, and the bailiff moved to take Caio into custody. Through it all, I sat perfectly still, letting the reality of the moment wash over me. Guilty. He was guilty. It was over. As they led Caio away, he turned to look at me one last time. Our eyes met across the crowded room, and in that moment, I saw a flicker of the man I'd once loved. Regret, sorrow, and something that might have been an apology passed across his face. Then he was gone, disappearing through a side door, out of my life forever. Outside the courthouse, I faced a sea of reporters, their questions coming at me like a tidal wave. But for once, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I stepped up to the microphones, Sarah at my side, and began to speak. Today, justice has been served, I said, my voice clear and strong. But this isn't just about one man's crime. It's about standing up to those who would abuse their power, who would betray trust for their own gain. It's about showing that no matter how far you fall, you can always get back up. I paused, looking out over the crowd. To everyone who has supported me, who has stood by our company during these difficult times, thank you. Your faith in us has not been misplaced. We are committed to moving forward, to continuing to innovate and create technology that makes a difference in people's lives. This experience has only strengthened our resolve to do business with integrity, transparency, and a dedication to doing what's right. As I finished speaking, a cheer went up from the crowd. I felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, relief, and a renewed sense of purpose. This chapter of my life was closing, but another one was just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. There were interviews to give, board meetings to attend, and a company to run. But through it all, I felt a sense of lightness I hadn't experienced in months. The shadow of Caio's betrayal no longer loomed over me. I was free to move forward, to focus on the future. One evening, about a week after the trial, I found myself back in my office long after everyone else had gone home. I stood by the window, looking out over the city, just as I had the night before the trial began. But this time, the view felt different. The city lights no longer reminded me of broken dreams and betrayal. Instead, they sparkled with possibility. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. It was Sarah, a concerned look on her face. "Evelyn, it's late. You should go home, get some rest." I turned to her with a smile. "I will, soon. I needed a moment to take it all in." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?" "It has," I agreed. "But you know what? I wouldn't change it. As horrible as it was, this experience has taught me so much. About myself, about business, about life. I'm stronger now than I ever was before." Sarah smiled, relief evident on her face. "So, what's next for Evelyn Monteiro?" I turned back to the window, my mind already racing with ideas. "We've got a company to run, Sarah. And not just run, we're going to take it to heights Caio never even dreamed of. But we're going to do it the right way. With integrity, with purpose." As Sarah left, I remained by the window for a few more minutes, letting the energy of the city wash over me. The past year had been the hardest of my life, but I had survived. More than that, I had triumphed. Caio had tried to write me out of my own story, but instead, he had only given me the opportunity to write a better one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities. But for the first time in a long time, I felt truly ready to face them. Justice had been served, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my life, my company, and my future. As I finally turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the window. The woman looking back at me was stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before. She was a survivor, a leader, a force to be reckoned with. She was me. And my story was far from over.